30 лет назад в Беловежской пуще представители России, Белоруссии и Украины подписали соглашение, в котором констатировалось прекращение существования СССР как субъекта международного права и геополитической реальности и заявлялось о создании СНГ – Содружества независимых государств. Этому всемирно-историческому событию посвящен один из залов музея Бориса Ельцина и важная часть исследовательской работы всего президентского центра. Мы убеждены, что оно заслуживает серьезного обсуждения на международном уровне. Следствием этой убежденности стало то, что предстоящая дискуссия пройдет на английском языке. Я приношу извинения нашим русскоязычным слушателям и продолжу на английском. 30 years ago, on that day, December the 8th, the agreement was signed, declaring the demise of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States. For Boris Yeltsin Museum and the Presidential Center, this event is not just a part of our local history, but something that opens up a new chapter of the global narrative. Therefore, we ask our friend and academic partner Artemy Magun to invite prominent scholars from the leading Russian and Western universities to discuss the historical event on our online platform. We are glad that the following participants have joined the discussion: Alexey Yurchak, University of California; Jodi, College of Hobart and William Smith; Alexey Miller, European University of St. Petersburg; Keti, Chukhrov, High School of Economics; and Vyacheslav Morozov, University of Tartu. On behalf of the Presidential Center, I would like to give the floor to Professor Artemy Magun, moderator of today's discussion.
Hi, everyone. You're virtually attending a seminar, or you can call it a mini conference, where several intelligent people will discuss the destiny of the USSR, the destiny that lies in the past, fortunately or not. But as you know, there is an anniversary, small jubilee. 30 years, exactly 30 years ago, the leaders of several Soviet republics, the constituent federative republics of the Soviet Union, they gathered in Belorussia, Belovежская пуща, and decided to dissolve the Soviet Union. And this is the event that we are going to discuss. This is called the collapse of the USSR as a world historical event. So we will speak English, even though most of us are actually Russian, as you can see, except our dear guest, Jodi. But we speak English because we want really to put this into the world historical context. 30 years ago is in quite a bit of time, and we now have a certain distance that allows us to make some conclusions, even though, of course, as Chairman Mao famously said, the French Revolution was too recent, so it's early to tell. Of course, the same is even better applicable to the 91. Nevertheless, we already have some thoughts, so which we will share. And I will go first as an initiator of this event, not because I'm the smartest here, certainly not, but just because I started all this. Just a second. So, as I already said, the Soviet Union collapsed exactly 30 years ago. Simultaneously, in most of the new states, there started radical market reforms, which were supposed to rescue these states out of at least 3 years of a very severe economic crisis. In all of these states, the new constitutions were installed on the standard model of liberal democratic republics. And at the time, these events appeared to most intellectuals and educated people as a culmination, maybe not willed, maybe not it was not seen as, at the time, even by the active supporters of liberalism, as an optimal scenario. The dissolution of Soviet Union was not welcome for many. For some it was. But nevertheless, it was seen as an inevitable result of this very important beneficial process of emancipation and democratization that Gorbachev started and Yeltsin continued. In Russia, I mean, in other federative republics, of course, there were other leaders who continued Gorbachev's cause, or sometimes they didn't. Many of the previously marginalized representatives of intellectual class, intelligentsia, entered the new governments. Hundreds of previously tabooed practices, from casinos and strip clubs to speculative trade and professional gangsterism, now became easily available. And the new opportunities of international travel created I would say, an oceanic feeling of globalization. Suddenly we became citizens of the world. Market and democracy, Western style, became for many synonyms for utopia of a sort, an ideal against which people tended to evaluate, to judge the very imperfect institutions of the new Russia and of the new Estonia as well. Moreover, there was also a direct democratic moment because the events of the August 91, when the failed coup gathered hundreds of thousands of people at the streets, in the square, this created a feeling of solidarity, an impression that all of this had been won in struggle by the people from below, so that this was a genuine democratic revolution. At least this was a feeling. But the revolutionary momentum was very short-lived, and this for many reasons, among which, for example, there is the anti-political nature of the neoliberal ideology that started dominating in this movement, the conservative counter-revolutionary tendencies in the intellectual elites that prevented them really to become active revolutionaries, the socially disastrous results of the neoliberal economic reforms that followed immediately after the 91, and the deep schism of the society with regard to these reforms. And this schism was only reinforced by the newly installed parliamentary party, parliamentary institutions based on the competition of parties. Therefore, today, this event presents an ambiguous, I would say, Janus-faced, лицо Януса, по-русски, instance for the historical memory. Objectively speaking, and in the long run, this event, I would dare say, had hardly had very positive results for humanity. Arguably, some liberals may say it was beneficial for Russia because even now there are more public freedoms and more participation in the global life than in the late USSR. But at the same time, at that time, there was at least more than pure domination at stake. And now there is only pure domination. So this is a case not so rare, which stands against the theories of events, like Alain Badiou's theory of event. This event was emancipatory from inside. It was imminently emancipatory, imminently revolutionary, with its own imminent utopian future, a certain breakthrough, a solidarity, and of course, a process of political subjectivization for thousands of people. But retrospectively speaking, this event turned out to be reactionary, rather reactionary, not even in its far consequences, which would be, again, it would be normal. All events have some beneficial consequences, some disastrous consequences. But in this case, it immediately had very negative consequences. And as I wrote in my book, Negative Revolution, even the substance of the event was negative. It was a revolution of negativity, I would say, a libertarian revolution that didn't put any substance into the form of freedom. And that was the problem, not only in this case, but this was one of them. And so the event is ambiguous, and this is the topic of today's conference: how to look at this Janus, how to deal with this historical ambiguity. Again, this is an event that you cannot easily keep fidelity with, but you also it's very hard to betray it for those who, or at least for those who lived in this part of the woods. Now, this was my preamble, well, how do you say, my introduction. And I will abuse my powers, because apart from the introduction, I also want to give a short talk, I mean, to give a statement of some sort, for which I apologize. So you will have to tolerate me for a little more than you would tolerate the other speakers. And that, again, not because I'm more tolerable inherently. This is not true. Okay, so now what I want to say substantively about this problem. While the collapse of the USSR happened mainly as a consequence of an economic mismanagement and an economic disaster that was, that had external reasons too, of course. And while, of course, we all understand the importance of Gorbachev's actions, of some accidental course of history that contributed to this, at the same time, we can, of course, view the collapse of the Soviet Union as a result of the Cold War, which was not just the opposition of specific historical subjects, East and West, but also a struggle of ideas. And these ideas were, during the Cold War, understood as socialism and capitalism. This was a war between socialism and capitalism. Whatever this means. And I will say a few words about what this means. Socialism and capitalism seem to be totally opposite, or seem to describe two societies of completely different genres. For example, USA and USSR, or European countries and USSR. But actually, they are closely related. They both describe a set of institutions and measures relating to modern industrial economy. And both terms imply that economy dictates politics, that economical regime is fundamental, and then you can discuss democracy, you can discuss formal democracy, real democracy, but what is important is political economical regimes. So on that, there was a consensus. And then, of course, capitalism is really really refers to the way of organizing the ownership, way to organize the production, the entrepreneurs, the managers. The managers are entrepreneurs under this regime, and the regime is decentralized. So the focus is microeconomical, and it is implied that microeconomics defines the macroeconomics through competition, through the invisible hand of the market. While with socialism, it's the opposite. The macroeconomical concerns are most important. Distribution, the issues of distribution dictate the production in many ways. And both the distribution and the production are centralized. Still, I mean, again, the set of the issues is very similar, and both ideas, both types of regime, apply to advanced industrial economies. Now, first of all, in the process of the Cold War, socialism and capitalism became into correlative ideas. One was increasingly defined through the other, and vice versa. The very word capitalism actually emerged later than the word socialism, only by the end of the 19th century, and evidently in response to the notion of socialism, under the influence of this notion. Again, both relate to some kind of 19th century economical situation, so that liberals such as Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas actually attribute to society the effects that the left would narrowly explain by capitalism. So society is to blame, and that could mean socialism. Socialism and capitalism for Arendt would both apply to society, and that would be the root of all evil. Now, secondly, because they became correlative ideas, socialism and capitalism were increasingly engaged in a mutual polemic. Trotskyites and many social scientists after them accused Soviet socialism of being really just a state capitalism. Classic liberals and neoliberals persistently accused the European capitalism of tending towards socialism. Already in the 1960s, the new policies that imposed diversity and equal treatment under the pressure of the civil rights movement in the United States were coined by the conservatives to be dangerously close to the Soviet ones. For example, the term political correctness was invented then, and it was actually a citation from Soviet discourse, политически верный путь. In English, it was treated as political correct, as something political correct. So the irony was that the liberals supporting civil rights are actually the commies. There was a flurry of publications from Alan Bloom to Jordan Peterson and others who even now search for the origins of American identity politics in critical theory, which is in Marxism. This is strange, but this is the perception. So there is an exchange of polities already in the 60s and 70s, and this exchange is a sign of a dialectical process. We need to apply dialectical theory here, and this dialectical process sooner or later would lead to the transformation of these concepts, and then to the transformation of the phenomena themselves. And this is actually what happened. Actually, or again, in the aforementioned period in the 60s and 70s, many social scientists, both in US and USSR, started speaking of a convergence between the two systems. The term convergence was very popular. This was most famously argued by John Kenneth Galbraith, a prominent political theorist, economist, and actually a politician. But Galbraith actually just spoke out what many social scientists believed. Actually, the person who started this convergence discourse was Talcott Parsons. And the circles of Parsons really believed that Soviet and American systems are just subspecies of the same. And so that they will ultimately lead to some kind of global empire. Empire is my word, some kind of global unitary polity. The more left-leaning part of the Soviet studies in the United States, as you know, considered USSR as an alternative road to industrial society under the influence of Parsons and the like. While the Soviet and the post-Soviet historians actually insisted, and even now insist on the idea of totalitarianism. Kind of totalitarian theory is dominant in Russia, not in the United States. In the 1980s, until around 1989, most Soviet progressive economists, progressive meant advanced, popular, westernized, shared the convergence theories. I mean, most famous and influential of them was academician Abalkin, an advisor of Gorbachev. So the Gorbachev economic advisors were for convergence theory. Sakharov, on the other hand, who was not an advisor, who was a dissident and almost a prisoner of conscience, he famously wrote a large political manifesto calling for convergence. What prevented convergence from actually becoming implemented was the newly fashionable neoliberal doctrine, which gained ground, of course, in Britain and United States in the 80s, and also gained ground in USSR. The first articles in 1989 were by Larisa Piyasheva and Alexander Tsipko, who claimed that there was no convergence, no compromise. There was either or, either socialism or capitalism, like friend, enemy, and you have to choose. And of course, they choose liberalism. But neoliberalism, in turn, was elaborated in the West not without the help from CIA. It was a political instrument. It was a political ideology, which was consciously devised to counter socialism and to counter the idea of convergence. Neoliberalism was anti-convergence. So we have always to look at this polemic. And now let's turn to dialectics as such. It could have happened that socialism and capitalism, really very similar and complementary forms of industrial economy, would converge. It could also have happened that neoliberalism would end history and effectively turn USSR into a version of United States, catching up democracy. But under the laws of dialectic, this could not have happened. Instead, after colliding the two subjects and ideas, these two subject ideas, I would say, they went on, each carrying on the hybrid forms of socialism and capitalism in mutually incompatible ways, something like a chiasmus in rhetoric. Russia, preserving the background social fabric, style of rule, the macroeconomic structure from the socialist USSR, became radically pro-capitalist and individualist in its ideology and in its redistributive policies. For example, you can mention flat tax. Some joke that Russia now is like an American red state, which is a Republican, conservative state. United States, here, forgive me, Jodi, and forgive me, my American friends, does actually show a certain trend towards socialism. Not as much in economy until recently, but in its ideology and in its tendency to bureaucratization. Society does from below in America what USSR had imposed through the party pressure. It imposes some abstract bureaucratic civil religion, I would say, centered around the moral values of equality and imperial diversity. So social democracy in the West was not really extinguished by neoliberalism, but remained entrenched and continued to define the economic policy, even from its subsumed position under neoliberalism. And the persistence of socialism and capitalism and insulated forms, both, I mean, respectively, in United States and in USSR, in Russia. So their persistence as insulated forms and ideological superstructures is not innocent. The ideological insistence on capitalism, for instance, creates an anti-union momentum in both employers and employees, stimulates the luxury market, lets the intellectual be tolerant of inequality, so blocks the union of intellectuals with the lower stratas of society, etc. The ideological insistence on socialism in the United States turns measures of social justice into issue of public debate, moral censure, creates insulated quasi-socialist areas on the bourgeois basis, such as universities or urban anarchist communes. So to summarize, we deal with a capitalism in a socialist form in one case against the socialism in the capitalist form. But the argument is that they don't meet and they still are in opposition more or less the same way as they were in the Cold War, but a chiasmus has happened. So the 91 events led to a dialectical restructuring and a further complication of the confrontation that still goes on. Thank you. And now I step out of my hat of moderator and of presenter. And sorry, I step out of from my hat of presenter to my hat of moderator. That's the correct way to put it. And now I'm your moderator again. And then our next, actually we do, right, we, as a moderator, I must remind myself that we do have 5 minutes for questions. So if you have questions, yes, Jodi has a hand. I see Jodi.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question, Artemy, or just maybe a disagreement. I don't think your description of the U.S. Works. I mean, it's not like, universities aren't socialist spaces. That's a kind of a fiction. That's actually a fiction that's pushed on the right as part of the neoliberalization project to subject more and more of academia to market forces. Anything like a socialism that might be present in the US would be like the socialization of risk and but accompanied with the privatization of reward. So to my mind, your chiasmatic structure sort of breaks down, and actually what breaks down is the development is socialism. And instead what we have is two extreme forms of capitalism, both in Russia and the US, but it's the socialism that actually falls apart.
But they're very different. I mean, I knew you would disagree on that. And I know, this is an issue that is being debated, and because it is hybrid. Again, my argument, and I had to go short, my argument is that, of course, America is fundamentally, its social fabric is capitalist, and university is a capitalist enterprise because, of course, it's the students pay tuition, and salaries are very uneven across faculty and things like that. What I'm saying is that socialism for half of the country remains some kind of vague moral ideal. And this vague moral ideal produces concrete results if you organize life in certain insulated spaces. So in the universities, for instance, this is a phrase not from the right, but from many colleagues of mine in America. They say, okay, it's capitalism for everyone, but communism for university professors. Because, of course, many have tenure. There is no schedule. Intellectuals are in this, everywhere in the world, they are in this kind of privileged position. Which sometimes coexists with the precarious position, of course. But it is hybrid. So when you say that both types of capitalism are types of capitalism, I don't disagree. At the same time, for analytic purposes, I think we need to look very attentively at the types of these political economical regimes. Now that in current historical moment shows that there is the increasing split, increasing return to insulation, sovereignization, kinds of semi-iron curtains among countries. And this doesn't only have to do with the fact that they are capitalist competitors at the market, but also with their profound asymmetries in terms of their political economical regimes. So that's my point. Okay, but actually, Jodi is our next speaker, and so she can continue disagreeing in her talk, and I will then I will of course agree with her. Jodi, but I invented Jodi's title myself on the basis of what she told me, so it will be something on the collapse of the global left as a consequence of the Soviet collapse.
All right, thanks so much, Artemy. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. And what I'm interested in is is that we can't talk about 1991 at all without really emphasizing that 1917 was a world historical event, right? It was of international significance. 1917 meant the triumph of the working class, the opening to the building of socialism around the world. So I want to keep this world dimension before us, right? From the very start, let's say the establishment of the Comintern on the one hand, to the invasion of the new Soviet Union by 14 countries during the Civil War, right? So at the beginning, there's an international dimension, all the way to the end, right? Because the end of the Soviet Union is accompanied by this declaration of the final victory of capitalism and liberal democracy. So from the start to the end, the Soviet Union was not just any old country. It wasn't just the new name for a Russian empire. It wasn't just like any state that has a history and that comes and goes. Rather, the Soviet Union brought with us this kind of rupture of possibility in the world, this rupture of the hope for communism. And when it collapsed, or when it was defeated, or when it succumbed to counter-revolution or to reactionary forces, or when it just gave up. And I actually think, discussing these terms of how do we define the end, defeat, collapse, counter-revolution, I think this matters. But at any rate, once this defeat happens, then a major carrier of political hope, of the political hope for communism, was lost. So that's the first thing I want to emphasize. And this part of this, but even at the same time, that communism has a history, and that it has a history in the world, we have to recognize that that's also not a history confined to the Soviet experience, of course, right? It's been a feature of anti-colonial struggles with major thinkers and leaders like Amilcar Cabral from Guinea Faso and Cape Verde, Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso, Walter Rodney from Guyana. And this communism in world history has also been present in successful large-scale parties in Kerala and West Bengal in India, not to mention Vietnam and China, as well as countless smaller parties all over the world. Even all of these facts of world historical communism or communism in world history, even with these realities, the end of the USSR is felt as a or even the defeat of communism. So there's this strangeness of the way that the history of communism in the world and the world historical event of communism kind of interchange, and in some ways the world significance of it actually makes the communism in history kind of invisible, right? We stop seeing the force of communist revolution and communist revolutionaries in other countries. And we also all kind of feel this, or many feel this sort of stupid end of history that Francis Fukuyama wrote about years ago, that again, the defeat of the Soviet Union ends up being felt as a defeat of communism. Now, that's going to be my focus, but before I really focus on that, which is one of the reasons I also disagree with Artemy's kind of chiasmic presence of socialism, because I think it loses this emancipatory dimension of that and kind of collapses socialism into strange forms of bureaucracy. But at any rate, I just say that for the sake of polemics. I do want to mention a little bit of the material reality of the collapse and the effects on global communism, and then come back to the kind of symbolic dimension. And on real material effects, one place to look is, of course, Cuba, right? Because the effects on the collapse of the Soviet Union on Cuba were absolutely terrible. Cuba had to enter into its special period of severe economic contraction. It had depended quite heavily on Soviet imports, particularly oil. So when the USSR was defeated, the Cuban GDP shrunk by like over a third, right? Like 35%. I mean, this is primarily due to the loss of Soviet oil imports, because the Soviet Union was the primary provider of oil to Cuba, and they didn't really recover until they were able to interact, get trade relations going with Venezuela. But this and these effects of the loss of Soviet oil imports they rippled throughout the Cuban economy with not just like transportation, but having really strong effects on Cuba's agriculture, because their agriculture was heavily dependent on large-scale machinery, which again relied on oil to run, like giant tractors and combines and that kind of thing. And Cuba's sort of unique in this position, like Vietnam, which is also a heavy trading partner, was able much more quickly to pivot to other countries as trading partners. But Cuba, because it's only 90 miles from the United States and has been subjected to the U.S. embargo, was really quite heavily and negatively impacted, and found it much more difficult to recover. And then this, of course, starts to have effects on their ability to keep their goals. But we can talk more about Cuba later if anyone's interested. But I just wanted to bring that out, because most of the time we end up talking about Eastern Europe and the former East Bloc, because of course the material effects there were also really extreme and widely affected, and they persist in the re-entrenchment of class inequality and the re-entrenchment of corruption. We also see the material effects. Now I'm thinking more about the former East. We see this in rising authoritarianism, in far-right nationalism, in the decline in women's position. And I'm thinking right now of the abortion ban in Poland, which has become quite extreme. So extreme, it looks like they're establishing the central pregnancy registry so that women can't sort of secretly have abortions. And there's a cool kind of counter movement going on where women are supposed to send pictures of their tampons and their menstrual period as proof. And they're doing this as a kind of like, so, okay, well, we can prove we're not pregnant. Here you go. And then, in a related vein, if Kristen Godsey's argument that women had better sex under socialism if that's true, right, and they had better sex because they were significantly less dependent on men, then we can say there's probably also a decline in sexual satisfaction as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That the material effects are widespread. The Soviet Union, as everyone knows, the Soviet Union defeated fascism at the cost of over 20 million Soviet lives. With the defeat of the Soviet Union, we have seen the return of fascism. And here, the material and the ideological are virtually inseparable, insofar as there is no strong state alternative to, no strong visible opponent to anti-communism, right? Instead, what we have is unbridled capitalism and unbridled nationalism, which have flourished in the wake of communism's departure. And this not just in the former East. Hard right nationalists, white supremacists, anti-immigrants are increasingly emboldened worldwide. I'm thinking primarily of the US and Brazil, as well as Hungary and Poland. For anti-communist, the specter of communism is as haunting and maybe even more terrifying than the USSR ever was. And in fact, they use the specter of communism to attack anything and everything. And Artemy also mentioned this as well, the way that anti-communism is used to attack anything that's associated with the left and to try to stain it with some association with the Soviet Union specifically. I mean, we've been all been seeing this, I think, recently in the right-wing mobilization around masks and in opposition to masks and vaccines. This is not just in the US, we're seeing it a lot in Europe, where the opposition to vaccines and masks is voiced in terms of the specter of state control over lives and bodies, rather than in more reasonable dimensions of, are these good or bad public health measures, right? Instead, it's like, oh God, no, it's the Soviet Union coming back. Women's reproductive health and freedom, as I've already mentioned, here, these are assaulted insofar as saying, oh, if women have the ability to choose to take care of make their own health decisions. That means that there's a communist assault on the family, and the logical repercussion of that will be a total breakdown of all of gender roles, and we will have state-run daycare. Some on the left mindlessly echo these anti-communist sentiments when they reject and excoriate parties and centralized political organization as outmoded Leninism. This is why when Artemy associated anarchism with some kind of socialism on the left, I don't think that's so. The anarchists in the US don't think of themselves as socialists, right? They're much more libertarian than that. So I don't think that linkage works. But at any rate, what I want to bring up here is the way that there is the way that the defeat of the USSR appears on the left in the US as a rejection of the form of political struggle that's necessary for taking state power. And it's like, well, it doesn't work, right? State power, state parties don't work. We don't need them. Now, before I conclude, I want to say a little bit more about the ways that the defeat of the USSR manifests or is felt as a defeat of communism. And of course it has, and I should be clear, but I'll just emphasize just in case that I'm not saying that the USSR really achieved communism. I'm not saying that it was a fully realized utopian communist, withering away at the state or anything like that. Rather, what I'm saying is that the USSR stood for, it was the symbol of communist aspiration and possibility. And its defeat has let anti-communism, as fascism, as capitalism, as nationalism, as racism, as neoliberalism, it's let this run amok, virtually unopposed, since liberalism has never been able to defeat fascism on its own. Liberalism tolerates fascism. Sometimes it even relies on it to do its dirty work, right? I'm thinking here of the way Zizek talks about this kind of obscene supplement. So thinking of fascism as liberalism's obscene supplement. Just one example, we see this in the US in the deep imbrication of anti-Black racism and anti-communism. Even as early as 1918, when white mobs attacked Black soldiers returning from the World War I front, and when Black people fought back against these attacks on Black soldiers, the white press blamed the Bolsheviks. Right, the white press in the U.S. in 1918 blamed racial conflict not on white lynch mobs, but on the Bolsheviks. Right, it was the Bolsheviks that were empowering Black people to stand up against white lynch mobs. And then later in the 1950s, this continued. Segregationists defended Jim Crow apartheid in the US South on the grounds that integration was a communist plot. So communism is the name for the political struggle of the working class and the oppressed, the struggle against property and exploitation, and for equality, justice, and freedom from the dictates of bosses, landlords, owners, and banks. Anti-communism isn't just an empty gesture, and it's not just a way to demonize opponents. It indicates an opposition to equality, a politics that rejects the idea of collective labor for collective benefit. Liberal anti-communism and fascist anti-communism go hand in hand, and they do so for the same reasons, to protect capitalism. Communism is that modern ideology, always and everywhere on the side of the oppressed. When labor is strong, when those who have been racially, sexually, ethnically, and colonially oppressed become more visible and more organized and more militant, then anti-communism intervenes to set up barricades. Anti-communism structures the political field by establishing the terrain of possibility, establishing what's available, like what's a political alternative, what's totally off the table, what's unthinkable. Even when anti-communism claims that communism is itself impossible, when it says that it's defeated or doesn't work, anti-communism still tries to mobilize forces to oppose communism. It actually fights against the impossible. When there was a Soviet Union, the impossible fought back. More precisely, it had a place to defend and from which to fight, a place from which to pursue communism, to persist as a hope worth fighting for. With the defeat of the Soviet Union, the liberals and some social democrats say that hope itself is wrong, not worth fighting for, indefensible. And this defeat is their proof. So I'll end by saying that it's the defeat of hope and the evocation of defeat as a way to continue to push hope down is one of the massive world historical effects of 1991.
Thanks so much, Jodi. As usually, this is very clear, nothing to add, but maybe there are some questions. I actually, as I said, I 90% agree. I would subscribe totally. Just that you need to distinguish between USSR and the idea of communism, and I would say between socialism and communism. So there are some nuances here. And Soviet Union continuously did very much to discredit the idea of communism. For example, in the 70s, the French intellectuals who were, well, first they were communists, then they became Maoist, but there was a more or less a consensus on the far left in the French intelligentsia. But in the 70s, they withdrew en masse, and they went to the right, and this move continues still. Why? Because they translated into French the Gulago archipelago Gulag, Solzhenitsyn. For them, Solzhenitsyn, for French culture, is like a seminal event, more seminal than in Russia, maybe. At that time, you know, not many ready. Because it was such a disappointment. And of course, if you say that Soviet Union was a symbol of communism, then what's the problem? Then today, China is the symbol of communism. They have a communist party. They also have speeches about the Leninism and the communism in the future. The Soviet Union was tending in the same direction. Again, I fully agree, but then the very problem with the symbol that it kind of went obsolete. And then there comes the question of whether socialism was really located in certain institutions. And I see why you think so. But at the same time, these institutions were also connected with a certain national history, certain national culture. And without Russia, all of these countries in Africa, in Central Asia, they were unable to carry on. While in the West, in Europe, in the United States, socialism is well and alive. That was my argument, which you disagreed with. You a little bit underestimate this due to your position, because you are in the United States, so you don't see your own position as objectivity. And your own position as objectivity reminds us that there is a place in the world where there is strong communism, at least in theory, in movement. And this place, I'm sorry, is United States and Western Europe. Here, it has been defeated. Now let's move to Alexey Miller, who will continue, in a sense, this global theme with his talk on the dissolution of USSR and the search for an alternative empire.
Thank you, Artemy. So I shall focus on point 1 of the agenda, which Artemy suggested that for discussion. I'll do my best to compensate for his abuse of time as a moderator, and I'll be short. Now, the dissolution of the USSR was interpreted and is interpreted until today as the dissolution of the last empire. And if we look at probably the most important political text of 1990, which is Solzhenitsyn's How Should We Reorganize Russia, it seems at the first glance that what he is trying to say confirms this interpretation. He says, I'll quote him in Russian so that English translation doesn't allow for misinterpretations. Нет у нас сил на окраины, ни хозяйственных, ни духовных. Нет у нас сил на империю. Fine. But what is he actually proposing? What is he actually doing in this text? He begins with saying that 3 Baltic republics, 3 Caucasian republics, 4 Central Asian republics, and Moldavia should be, by all means and without possible return, separated. Непременны и бесповоротно отделены. He even adds that if some of these republics have hesitations whether they should separate themselves from the Soviet Union, с той же несомненностью вынуждены объявить о нашем отделении от них мы оставшиеся. So it doesn't matter what they think about their possible future in or outside what remains of the Soviet Union. They're supposed to be kicked out. Special case is Kazakhstan, because he wants the northern part of Kazakhstan to stay in what remains of the Soviet Union, plus Ukraine without her western part, plus Belarus. He even mentions at a certain point that certain regions of the Russian Federation, particularly those in Northern Caucasus, can also live. And what emerges out of this reasoning is actually a very precise description, according to the experience of the 20th century. So very precise description of the image of big imperial Russian nation, which was at the core of the imperial project of the Romanov Empire in the second half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. It was not about dissolution of the Romanov Empire, it was about crystallization of a nation in this empire, the same way as it was done in France, Spain, Hungary, elsewhere. So from this perspective, the Soviet Union was, of course, a huge rupture compared to the Romanov Empire, in a sense that it basically tried to undo all the achievements of this project, which I'm talking about. Ukrainian identity and Belarusian identity as separate national identities were instituted. Territorialization and institutionalization of ethnicity took place. Great Russian chauvinism was proclaimed the main enemy of the Soviet power, and so on and so forth. So when saying that the Soviet Union has no future. At the same time, Solzhenitsyn says that let us come back to certain elements of imperial project of the 19th and early 20th century. And here we come to the question, what actually happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? There was a very brief and short period of time when elites which controlled power in Russia at that time were so disoriented and had such a lack of confidence in themselves that they were prepared to behave themselves as if they were the elites of the emerging nation state. They were prepared to cede certain elements, certain fractions of their sovereignty as a payment for being allowed to join the collective West, and so on and so forth. Now, this period was really very short. And actually, if we look at those people to whom this message was addressed in the West, it was very clear that they actually, first, were not interested in it, and second, didn't trust it seriously. They knew better than the guys in Moscow in 1992 that Russia doesn't feed this model of a nation state with limited sovereignty, because basically nation states in the West have limited sovereignty. Now, it is interesting that even early Yeltsin all the time speaks about certain privileged partnership which Russia deserves in this collective West. But very soon, it became clear that what was actually going on was a search for a new form of imperial polity. What I mean, what are these elements of imperial polity which somehow re-emerged as those of crucial importance, not only for elite thinking, but also for popular imagination in this country. Number one is undivided, uncompromised sovereignty. Number two is sphere of influence. We are now talking parallel to two guys who are exactly discussing whether Russia has a right to claim this sphere of influence. But it is clear that all Russian behavior in post-Soviet space is a behavior of a polity which tries to keep a sphere of influence. It was not an attempt to reconstruct the Soviet Union. The kicking out of the republics took place and actually turned out to be rather profitable in economic terms for Russia. Yes, with certain problems, but most of these problems emerged. Ukraine and Belarus didn't fit into the scenario which Solzhenitsyn was suggesting. it is very clear that all de facto states, non-recognized states, all these points of tension which were created by Moscow or with the help of Moscow on the post-Soviet space were not an attempt to annex these territories, but keep some sort of control of these territories. The same is about whatever you look at. Northern Caucasus, Southern Caucasus, Ukraine, the Red Line, as far as their NATO membership is concerned, Central Asian republics. It is interesting how China actually was willing to somehow take into consideration these Russian imperial sensitivities. It didn't try to kick Russia out of this region, although it had enough resources to do that. So what I'm trying to say is that what Russia was doing at that time and continues to do until today is an attempt to adjust her imperial nature and impossibility of creating a nation state to new conditions. Empire is not gone, not only in Russia, but in the world. And this empire, which consists of indirect control, indirect influence, empire which was once described by Michael Doyle as the empire of Athens in Greece. That is what Russia is today. That is why the status of great power with the right for the sphere of influence is of such huge importance. So in this sense, the 1917 is a huge rupture because it was dramatically new imperial project. But in certain sense, as we know in Russia, it's a famous saying that in Russia, everything changes from day to day, but nothing changes if we look from perspective of a century. In this sense, nothing changed. Russia was an empire. As a Romanov empire, it was an empire as the Soviet Union, and it continues to be empire today. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexey. Are there any reactions? I mean, the obvious reaction would go into the same area where Jodi went. Maybe Jodi should have asked this question, but I am too impatient. The empire of Soviet Union was different, right, from the Russian empire that you are talking about, which is more or less traditional empire centered around power, national identities, okay, some kind of hegemony of certain culture. While Soviet empire was ideocratic, right? It was about ideas, and because of these ideas, Soviet Union managed to really to become a global empire, not like Romanovs. Really, Romanovs didn't control Africa or Cuba. So that was done not with the force of arms and not with the attraction of, I don't know, Orthodox Christianity, but with the attraction of Marxism. I guess it's not even an objection, but there is an interesting theoretical question about the two kinds of empire, like more or less nation-centered empires and idea-centered empires.
I don't think that this opposition has to be described like this. It is not nation-centered empires versus idea-centered empire, in my view. Actually, if we look at how the Soviet Union worked with this instrument, ideological instrument, it turns out that it was extremely inefficient. Wherever you look, when you look at Central European societies immediately after the defeat of Nazi Germany, when they were prepared to adjust themselves, adopt certain elements of this project, and Soviet Union was unable to provide any, how to put it, attractive version, the communism with a human face. If you look at Latin America, where hundreds of thousands of people visited Soviet exhibitions in 1960s, the USSR failed to convert it in something more stable. My feeling is that, yes, it was, they had this instrument, they didn't know how to use it. They were poor global imperialists. Actually, they betrayed the idea of global imperialism once when they decided that the global revolution is over and transformed the Soviet Union into besieged fortress. Yes, if we look closer at the history of the Soviet Union, there are various periods, but by late 20s, early 30s, these elites, how to put it, the only effective global instrument they had was Pseudoplatov.
Okay. If there are no immediate reactions, let's go to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Keti Chukhrov from the High School of Economics and other places that she will name herself. And the topic is semantic mutations of historical socialism in the post-communist East-West relations.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Artemy. I'm glad to see my comrades and really honored to be part of this discussion. Well, everything that had already been said resonates very much with my research that I have been doing for years. But now I would like to concentrate on certain mutations when critique of socialism, of historical socialism, is applied. So the two extreme vicious reactions to the former USSR and its demise are either intensified nostalgia colored with imperialist and nationalist moods, or on the contrary, the project of total decommunization that is intended to erase the Soviet legacy as the criminal past or colonial subjugation. We see this attitude in Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic republics. Now, both extremes disavow the main systemic principles of socialist production, taking USSR as empire solely, the principles disavowed are equality, commonwealth, internationalism, censorship of luxury profit, And they highlight what in historical socialism was never thematic, even though this non-thematic deviation might have emerged as fallacy. So they emphasize imperialism of Russian state, hegemony of Russian language, corruption, bribery, elitism of nomenclatura and intelligentsia, shadow economy, and the so-called kinship and nepotism or blood within bureaucratic apparatuses. Now we see that both extremes erase fundamental principles and focus on something that was non-socialist, that was deviation of socialism, and they take anti-socialist features as if they were socialist, either to somehow increase the impact of USSR as empire or decrease it as a vicious state. I would like to focus now on these paradoxes of critique. And I have three paradoxes. Now, when certain post-socialist states refer to USSR critically with the aim to claim how terrible socialism was, they come up with those features that are anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, and were rather violations of socialism. For example, distributive economy is criticized as the embodiment of shadow trade, the reason for which capitalism as an open economy that reveals profits transparently implies less corruption and is consequently less vicious and a more just economy. Yet what is ignored in such logic is that shadow economy was the violation of distributive economy, not its rule. Now, what are the consequences of such logic? If such anti-socialist logic proceeds to think that precisely because of socialist economy's hypocritical chastity, it tacitly implies shadow violations, because we could think that it was the system that implies these violations, and it was this chaste system that could not evade these violations. We could answer to this that socialist economic system does not contain this violation. It is the system that is honest and chaste, and human factor that cannot fit it. And this is even my argument in the book that I wrote, Practicing the Good. Therefore, all violations against socialist economy are non-systemic, in the gray zone of semi-criminal distribution, which cannot be associated with socialism's political economy, but become its criminal alter ego or capitalist alter ego. Now, what is the post-socialist outcome to this liberal critique and to the erasure of the social, cultural, and political economic components of historical socialism, especially in former socialist republics? I don't concentrate on leftist critique of socialism and take liberal critique. So the outcomes of such critique: all emancipatory remainders of social state, like free education, healthcare, social housing, are censured and associating with their deviations and associated with the embodiment of corruption. We don't need free healthcare because it will be corrupt. Free housing will be corrupt. Free education was corrupt, and hence it embodies the corruption. And engenders elitism, nepotism. And consequently, privatization and profit-making start to represent justice, healthy economy, and public welfare, because they are transparent and open. This was a very important argument during the transition from a falsely chaste economy of socialism to the open and sincere profit-making of capitalism. Now, this is the reason the principal component of leftist rhetoric, deprivatization, progressive taxation, disappear from the post-Soviet democratic government's agenda. And paradoxically, they emerge later in anti-democratic, anti-liberal rhetoric of conservative, nationalist, hyper-oligarchic alliances that take over the pro-Western liberal democracies. This is a very important argument because if we look at Russia, where is Communist Party? Communist Party is in alliance with the most oligarchic, nepotist, kinship-oriented, anti-democratic, anti-Western government of Putin, which brings back the vicious corruption in combination with the rhetoric of imperialist state. And this rhetoric, paradoxically, includes protection of the unprivileged, whereas the protection of the unprivileged was absent in the rhetoric of liberal Democrats. And it is mainly absent in the rhetoric of liberal Democrats elsewhere in the former Soviet republics. For instance, Союз правых сил, the union of right liberal forces, was not coming up with such argument. Consequently, the anti-Western conservative hyper-oligarchy sweeps the left rhetoric and social state-oriented electorate. The only intermediary figure that entered this left populist agenda and could have chance to break this logic was, of course, Navalny. Now, the same logic with even more grotesque features we see in Georgia. I was following the ongoings and would like to shortly mention it. The liberal democratic, radically pro-Western progressive government is overtaken by anti-Western, anti-democratic oligarchy, co-opting with alt-right nationalists, and it defies pro-Western democracy, but grants attention to charity towards the poor. What is the result to this? That liberal democratic opposition to conservative nationalist state deals with limited soft emancipation like queer equality, pride parade, identity representation, and it purges from its agenda the hardcore emancipatory programs implying social responsibility and broader emancipatory issues, housing, education, healthcare. And the most important consequence to this is that liberal democratic social agenda cannot criticize capital and capitalism, as the absence of capitalism is associated with non-Western Soviet corrupt forms of shadow economy, with shortages of goods, and hence there is the proper democratic capitalism as the ideal, some kind of Western democratic ideal capitalism, and the vicious autocratic post-Soviet failed capitalism, which is no capitalism at all. And if it is not real capitalist business, but simply corruption, then the progressive liberal ideal is a proper capitalism, and it has to defy the idea of socialist democracy or any idea of social state support for the unprivileged population. Now, the second paradox that I would dwell on is a little bit different, but it is also crucial. It is the issue of naturalization. For example, certain phenomena of capitalist condition, like alienation, desire, consumption, forms of enjoyment, are very often in post-structuralism depicted as natural. For instance, alienation is irreversible. It is unsurpassable in all texts, starting from Foucault through Castoriadis, Deleuze, and up to contemporary texts of post-Operists. But Marx shows in his argument about verwandelte Formen, converted forms, that what seems natural is the outcome of political economic production based on surplus value. So quite like certain things that seems natural in capitalism, but is concocted and contrived by its economy, the same can be somehow shifted into socialist logic. Certain things that we bring from our retroactive memory and which seemed absolutely indispensable and natural in socialism, for instance, healthcare, education, basic needlessness of competition, certain forms of commons concerning public space and shared economy, post factum occurred to be acquisition of harsh political struggle. And I agree here with Jodi with October Revolution. So something that used to be natural then is clear that was not natural and was the result of harsh struggle brought by October Revolution. And finally, the last paradox and the last issue is about this split between the noble emancipatory ideas, which were so good and which everyone agrees with in socialist idea, socialist project, and their rigid and totalitarian implementation, which happened too disciplined, excessively organized, prohibiting certain forms of culture and consumption and social behavior. But my approach is that it becomes evident with the study of the political-economic impact of sociality of USSR and of the Soviet context, that precisely those ideas that represent beautiful and attractive utopia are not at all the realm of enjoyment and simply freedom. They, from the very start, had always been about necessity, zeal, and duty, rather than enjoying new forms of freedom. In other words, the common good has never been the realm of liberties, but the realm of constraints. And we probably will be understanding this more and more. And in that case, many components that seem to be restrictions are simply part and parcel of the economics of equality. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keti. Questions or comments? I like this last point very much about the austerity. So the future is with masochism, not with narcissism. I totally support. But one counter argument one could offer to you is more towards your first part. If you are saying that Soviet Union was actually about all these values of shared sociability, equal access, lack of competition, blah, blah, blah. And then you say, well, yes, that's what is important. And then, of course, the reality was far from the ideal. But then you don't have to mix the two up. But wait a minute. I mean, let's talk about any other regime. Let's speak about capitalism. Capitalism, one can argue, it's not my argument, but an imagined opponent will say that capitalism is really about progress, about transparency, about individual rights.
This is what I was saying.
Right. No, but wait a minute. So these are all good things in principle. But unfortunately, in the everyday reality of application of implementing capitalism, there are also bad things, such as inequality and selfishness of people, aggression. Mm-hmm. These are bad things, and capitalism is not about them. Capitalism is fighting against them with very fierce energy through parliamentary means. It's the same argument. I mean, about most of the regimes, except maybe for fascism, which was, No,
I mean, definitely capitalism has its own common good. This is what you're saying. I absolutely agree. But it also has certain rule not to approach in any way and not to destroy private property, and the right of the producer for profit and surplus. But also what is important is the right for desire and enjoyment, which in Soviet context is of course criminalized.
Enjoyment was not criminalized. I mean,
surplus enjoyment was criminalized.
Vyacheslav Morozov will give a talk and show that in reality, of course, it was all about enjoyment. You can say that in ideal it was not.
Maybe it was about, wait. Maybe it was about joy, but not enjoyment.
Maybe. No, but the last half of the existence of the Soviet Union was its bourgeois transformation. That's what Alexey and Yurchak and Vyacheslav, they both are claiming.
This is definitely important, but this was shadow part of the Soviet Union, which was deviant from the system.
Yeah. Alexey from the University of Berkeley will speak on the 1980s and 90s as a symbolical interregnum.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Artem. So thank you for the events, and thank you, my dear co-participants, for creating this important event. I'd like to go back actually to the event of the collapse itself. We are gathering here on December 7th, not by chance. There was the more or less very precise moment which we can identify with the disintegration. So in addition to speaking about the promises and the aftermaths, we can also talk about the event itself. And I would like to talk about a certain symbolic rupture, the way I see it, which was part of that event. And probably the kind of view I would like to suggest is very reductive, and sometimes a healthy dose of reduction in the view allows one to focus. So obviously, for lack of time, it's going to be that very precise focus. So the collapse of the Soviets, yeah, and also I wanted to say that because we were given 10 minutes each, I would like to read. Otherwise, I will start wandering. So the collapse of the Soviet state was one of the most dramatic events in modern history. To most people, that event was actually unexpected. In the decades before that event, most common Soviet citizens, as well as country's leadership, experienced the Soviet system as quite immutable, and I would say eternal. This perception was also shared by most Western Sovietologists. For that academic field, the Soviet collapse spelled a profound crisis of disciplinary identity. Prominent historian Martin Malia wrote that Western studies of the Soviet Union had, quote, done nothing to prepare us for the surprise of the past 4 years. And Theodore Draper added that despite all the mysteries of the Soviet system, its biggest mystery turned out to be why it came to such an unexpected end. Even conservative George Kennan sounded less than celebratory when he wrote, quote, I find it hard to think of any event more strange and startling, and at first glance more inexplicable than the sudden and total disintegration and disappearance from the international scene of the great power known as the Soviet Union. All these comments are coming very quickly after the event. The common feeling of surprise was summarized by Cornelius Castoriadis, who wrote, quote, search as one might, it is impossible to find a historical analogy to this pulverization of what seemed just yesterday a steel fortress. The granite monolith has suddenly shown itself to be held together with its saliva, unquote. Of course, there existed other opinions and other predictions on the possibility of the Soviet collapse. A famous example is the essay by dissident historian Andrei Amalrik, Will the USSR survive until 1984, which he wrote in 1969. Amalrik thought that the aging of the party leadership would lead to dramatic upheavals, as a result of which the country would either need to liberalize or face catastrophic crisis. But Amalrik clearly couldn't see how the Soviet Union functioned internally. No one could see it. In fact, the liberalization of the Soviet system during perestroika, about which she wrote, did not save that system, but on the contrary, brought it down. Also, Malrik's essay was a rare exception that proved the general rule, as most reactions to that essay at the time illustrate. Among Western specialists, virtually no one tended to take Malrik's essay at face value as a piece of political prediction, writes historian Walter Laqueur. An American professor of international politics remembers that, quote, most young graduate students in Soviet affairs were assigned to read Amalrik's essay, but primarily in order to critique it. And among Soviet dissidents, the reaction was similar. The emigre employees of Radio Liberty in Munich thought Amalrik's essay was fabricated by the KGB as a provocation. Even academician Sakharov, who knew Amalrik personally and was sympathetic to his thinking, could not talk about his essay without irony. These reactions illustrate how hard it was to imagine in the 1970s and 80s the Soviet coming collapse. However, in the 3 decades since that event, today, right, the Soviet collapse has been reinterpreted. Instead of being unexpected, it is now commonly discussed as inevitable, both in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere. But was that event inevitable? Did it have to happen in the time and in the manner in which it occurred? The Soviet collapse took place as an unintended result of the attempts by the party reformers to rejuvenate the Soviet system. They unintentionally undermined the symbolic foundations of that system. As a result of that symbolic undoing, all other problems that had been very real and extremely consequential, but were not yet fatal, were suddenly rendered profound. These other problems included economic stagnation, popular discontent, growing ethnic nationalisms, the burden of arms race, and so on. It's all well known. But I would suggest that it was first the crisis of the symbolic foundation that made all these other problems devastating. So at the symbolic foundation of the Soviet project was the claim that Lenin's word was synonymous with truth. However, during early perestroika, it became clear that Lenin's word had been distorted during all previous periods of Soviet history, and that in order to rejuvenate socialism, it was necessary first to return to the real, undistorted Lenin. This task was articulated in endless statements by the party leadership and in visual images issued by the party press. I will use a few visual illustrations in my talk just to save time, because as we know, visuals can communicate a lot quickly. So for decades, the public statement, let me just share, I have just a few. So for years, the public statement, Lenin is with us, I have these images on the left here, the 1960s, 70s, was quite ubiquitous and of course widely circulated, as we know. It described Leninism as the unquestionable foundation of the Soviet system. But in 1988, the party press transformed that statement into a question. This is the image on the right. Is Lenin with us? Lenin s nami? The real Lenin here on the picture is hidden behind the distorted Leninism of the party rhetoric, all these different slogans which obscure him. On another poster from 1988 called 1985, which is a reference to the beginning of the reforms, real Lenin is obscured by a dirty window of Soviet history. But by the final stage of perestroika, by around 1989, 1990, the political goal of reforms has mutated to something else. The journal Communist started its programmatic article in February 1990 with a familiar statement: the central task of perestroika is to cleanse socialism of Stalin's distortions and once again endow it with the true ideals of Lenin, the soul and heart of socialism that Stalin had stolen. But then very quickly, the journal added something new. Returning to real Lenin meant, quote, stepping on the path of experiments and not dogmas, and investing socialism with new and previously unknown content. So returning to real Lenin was now openly equated with stepping into the unknown. A paradox emerged in the party discourse. On the one hand, it was still argued that the central task of perestroika was to return to real and undistorted Lenin. On the other hand, it was now also argued that real Lenin was unknown and needed to be discovered. Now the political goal was no longer about returning to undistorted words that Lenin once said in the past, but about imagining what Lenin might have said were he alive today. In spring 1990, the placard press of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union issued the following poster. It says, "Let Lenin speak, Slovo Lenino." The large red podium with the Soviet coat of arms and microphones here symbolized the old, canonized and therefore distorted Leninism. But Lenin himself, real Lenin, was sitting on the stairs under the podium, writing down something in his notebook, something about the present situation. But we do not know what he is writing. To find out, we must let Lenin speak again. Another poster, also of the party press of the Central Committee in 1990, showed Lenin literally rising from the dead. He is walking out of the mausoleum where his embalmed body used to lie. He carries a bucket with white paint in which he wrote on the facade in his own handwriting with communist salutations, Ulyanov Lenin. So this, in his own handwriting, is important. In April 1990, the journal Communist suddenly changed the design of its cover. For 60 years, the cover remained the same, with the title printed in a heavy Soviet font, the picture on the left, on a traditional grayish background. But now the title was rejected, and as an instance of canonized, distorted, dead discourse of Leninism. On the new, less orthodox and more upbeat cover, the word communist was written in Lenin's own hand, copied from a handwritten draft of his manuscript. So in these statements and visuals, I want to stop sharing. In these statements and visuals, all of them illustrate the new task around 1990. And that task was to bring Lenin's voice in Lenin's hand back to life and let them speak and write new things today. But how to do this in practice? One solution was suggested by a leading party theoretician, Georgy Shekhnazarov, who proposed to inject Lenin's old texts with texts by other thinkers on whose work Lenin used to draw, such as Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel. This approach could allow the party to generate new Lenin's texts, as it were, that he could have written himself had he been alive. This solution, Shekhnazarov argued, would create a new Leninist revolution, now theoretical consciousness, and no one would approve of this revolution more than Lenin himself, unquote. Another party theoretician, Vladimir Amelin, proposed doing the same by mixing Lenin texts with Gramsci's. Even though they never met, and Gramsci was much younger, there was a certain parallel thinking in their texts, he argued. So the party was now expected to play a radically new role vis-à-vis Lenin. Instead of being the chief interpreter of Leninist texts, as the party claimed it had done for decades, it now needed to be a kind of ventriloquist, saying things on Lenin's behalf that he had never said, but might have said, were he allowed to speak today. That approach implied that Lenin's voice was treated as empty voice, that was devoid of speech, so to speak, as the voice of truth that didn't say anything concrete until the party ventriloquist invested that voice with speech. But that also implied that the foundational truth of the Soviet system, the truth which was equated with Lenin's word and was articulated in his voice, was now also empty. It was truth as such, truth that lacked semantic content. This was one of the aspects, or perhaps the key aspect, of a certain symbolic mutation at the very basis of the Soviet political project. And an intentional rupture, a result of the attempt to revisit the real Lenin and to restart the whole Soviet project from that basis. Every foundational maxim of the Soviet system was now questionable. The goal of communism, the leading role of the party, and the reason for the Soviet state to exist. So the arc of Soviet history turned out to be precisely 74 years. It started in November 1917 and ended in December 1991. Thank you.
Great, thanks. You were probably the only one to fit the timing perfectly, but we are liberal here. Because, you know, Soviet Union is over, we can be a little liberal.
I can see that Jodi has a question.
Yeah. I don't see it. You, Jodi?
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating, and I really appreciate it. I have my question is about the on the one hand, it's about the conclusion, but I think because it also could be, well, anyway, it's about the argument regarding truth, and at the end you're saying that the challenge was that, you know, the truth is sort of disconnected from some kind of semantic content, and then it becomes sort of too loose and open, and the foundation is lost. But what about understanding, what if the notion of truth at work was different? What if there was an idea of truth as a kind of method, and a method of analysis, how Lenin works, how Lenin studied, how Lenin responded to failure as well as success? I mean, if you got a notion of truth that's not sort of as semantic, maybe this argument doesn't work as well, or maybe you couldn't for the amount of time bring that up. But I'm just wondering, what if Lenin's truth is associated with method?
Thank you, Jodi, very much for the question. I think the reforms could have gone differently, and the whole thrust of the reforms, the whole idea of what we're reforming and why, could have been formulated differently. And then probably the outcome would be different. We, of course, can draw a parallel with China, which has done very different kind of transformation, and many other possibilities can be thought of. But the claim during the Soviet history and the claim in the early perestroika, and actually through the whole perestroika, was that we need to return. You said, I said semantic, and probably I should not use the word semantic. I didn't mean the truth is simply in the articulation of a certain kind of a sentence, right? The claim was the truth is not really necessarily known yet, but it's equated with Lenin's word. That could not be questioned. Lenin and Leninist discourse is unquestionable. There's a certain unquestionable foundational truth which is there. So once you start questioning that, and that's exactly what was happening, right? At first they were arguing for discussing all the unknown dark periods of Soviet history and all those dark points which were progressively discussed from 85 to 88. And then eventually it led to the discussion of the fact that Lenin was distorted by all those different periods and all those different actors. And in order for us to really rejuvenate that project, we need to return to something undistorted. But the progressive search for that undistorted led to the fact that it all was distorted from the beginning. And we don't really know Lenin as a result, because we never really read Lenin. And then the realization around 1990, which is really interesting, of course, I didn't have time to flesh it out, was that, but why do we necessarily need to go to that set of statements from that period, which is so different? We need, exactly as you said, we need method. We need to have a method which would be similar about today. And that method means that we need to have a kind of a Lenin or something which is generating the truth, but about today, right? Not about certain semantic. And that undoes the claim that it's Lenin who is equated with truth. Now you basically are saying, maybe we can question Lenin. So that undoes the very premise of what the Soviet project is. Now maybe we can think about some other project, some other kind of socialism, which is exactly what's happening in 1991, this kind of debates. Maybe it's not about Leninism, right? But the foundation of the Soviet project is undone. And I think by that time, with all the other things which are unleashed by that, I don't know, mutation, you can say, or rupture on the level of the symbolic, there's no turning back. So basically, all this other crises become very consequential as a result of that. There's no legitimacy in the word of party at all as a result. It undid its own legitimacy unwittingly. So that's basically the argument. So you're absolutely right. The truth is not about semantic interpretation of this or that phrase. It's about the position out of which one speaks. And that position was destroyed. Yeah.
I will not ask a long question, but since Alexey asked me to intervene, I just say two things. First, Gramsci did meet Lenin, of course.
Yes, they did meet. Did I say they did meet? They met once, and Lenin was very impressed by him, actually. I have a whole section in the chapter, which I'm writing, about that meeting. It was fascinating.
Maybe I missed what you said.
Yeah.
Sorry. Then a second comment is that, yes, this whole 91 was also kind of symbolic suicide, or not just symbolic of this communist period. I mean, our current regime in Russia, of course, would never criticize itself and destroy itself, and thus it may be very longevous.
Yeah.
Well, Soviet Union was short-lived precisely because it was honestly proclaiming the values of freedom and all that. That's the historical paradox. And then one more thing is that this treatment of Lenin you mentioned is actually similar to the way they treat the founders in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's the very common civil religion practice. When you have a founder, then the founder lived long ago, so you kind of have the entire hermeneutic tradition of adding what maybe people thought he was thinking and whom he read and blah, blah, blah. Desedimentation of the tradition. So in a way, Lenin is similar to a constitutional founder here.
Well, yes and no. In a way, yes, because any kind of sovereign voice is imagined as being bracketed out of the system, right? Sovereignty is generated by that speaking voice, and it's external to the sovereign space. From that point of view, Lenin and the founding fathers in the US structurally are similar. But there's also a big difference in that Lenin's word cannot be, it can be reinterpreted, but always under the guise of being very faithful to it. It cannot be questioned openly. And that's through the whole Soviet history. The minute you start questioning it, it really undoes the system. It's not the case with the founding fathers. The founding fathers can be engaged with in a very particular kind of rhetoric, which is very critical. So it's not quite the same.
Okay, Alexey Miller wrote me that he will have to leave sharp at 9. So, but we will probably finish the main part by 9. But if someone has a question or comment specifically to him, just write to him in the chat or signal to me and I will give you the floor. Just an information for your информация к размышлению. And now our last but not the least speaker who will certainly summarize and conclude our learned conversation, which is Vyacheslav Morozov from the University of Tartu. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Artem. I'm not sure I can summarize such a rich discussion, and thanks a lot for inviting me to take part. But I'll probably pick up on Alexey's presentation and try to offer sort of a longer-term perspective on what happened in the late 80s and how that then evolved. I mean, I actually wanted to talk about the conservative content of perestroika, something that is more or less an established fact, including in Artemy's own book about perestroika as a conservative revolution. And invite you to think about what happened with conservatism since then, and also how our idea of progress has changed since the time of perestroika. And it's a bit difficult topic in the sense that I will be mostly focusing on Russia, but at the same time putting it in the global context. And sometimes some of my remarks only apply to Russia. Some of them have more global application in that sense. So let's start with a very basic idea that perestroika as such, paradoxically, was a conservative moment. And by conservatism, in that sense, I mean, of course, the idea, the belief in certain natural foundations of social life, that there is something that is beyond political critique, beyond intellectual critique, certain elements of society which need to be taken for granted and should not be in any way touched, because by doing that, you actually undo the entire social fabric. And in that sense, of course, the Soviet revolution of the late 80s was conservative because it happened under the slogan of restoration of something that was real, true, natural, and so on. And of course, one study that in particular is relevant here is the dissertation, and then also the other works by Timur Atnashev, where he writes about the significance of the concept of natural historical process for the perestroika discourse, the idea that there was a certain natural process of history, natural unfolding of history, and the Soviet project was just a deviation from that natural historical development, and the task was to return to that as soon as possible. And I would argue that this idea was actually shared by nearly everyone at the time. Sergei Prozorov very powerfully writes in his 2009 book about the 90s, the Russian politics of the 90s, as a diffuse spectacle of hegemonies and counter-hegemonies, reforms and counter-reforms, rises and falls, all of which were a priori thwarted in their ability to achieve any finality, and therefore were only of interest to their participants, not to the society at large. I would argue that this spectacle was also not very much of interest to the society at large, because the difference was not that huge after all, because it was all about restoring certain golden age, going back to some golden age. For liberals, it was pre-revolutionary Russia, or maybe the imaginary West. But for the more conservative camp, for let's say the traditionalist or nationalist conservatives, it was about the restoration of national spirit, going back to national spirit, to certain maybe rural values, traditional values, and so on and so forth. So the basic difference between these two camps was that what exactly to imitate. Whether you imitate the West, which is sort of real, but at the same time imaginary, because of course the image of the West in the Soviet discourse of perestroika was very much idealized. Or do you imitate a certain golden age in the Russian past and go back to that time, which is of course also entirely imagined and really impossible to come back to or in any way conceptualize beyond those fantasies. And at the same time, yes, it's also important to recognize that there were important differences in the sense of who was entitled to take part in this utopia in the future, you know, who was allowed to into the future with the thinkers of that time. So, for instance, for obviously the traditionalists were much more restrictive, much more exclusionary in their thinking, basing it quite often on outright racism or at least ethnic culturalist nationalism. But at the same time, if we think about how elitist the liberal discourse of perestroika was, how it actually culturalized and even almost racialized the concept of class and class difference, then I would argue that the difference again was not that significant, at least looking from today, and especially, you know, the experience of, let's say, the reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US on the part of the kind of classical liberal Russian elites, Eurocentric pro-Western Russian elites. And and it's enough to remember films like Heart of a Dog, you know, which was very much a symbol of perestroika and this kind of pro-normality discourse of perestroika, to actually appreciate the importance of this racialized differences. And then with the leftists, it was also in a certain sense the same, because of course, yes, there were all sorts of ideas circulating in the sort of left-wing socialist, democratic socialist, Stalinist socialist, whatever circles. But quite often, again, the idea was going back to Lenin, right? Well, as Alexey was arguing. And as long as Lenin was there as a collection of sacred texts, that discourse was conservative. As soon as Lenin was questioned in this position of a prophet, then the whole discourse basically collapsed on itself and gave way to basically pro-market, liberal, conservative ideas about Western normality as something that has basically just to be restored once again. I would say that also globally, of course, we are at the moment where, and in that respect, the perestroika discourse was very much a reflection of the global discourse, with its normalization of the market, with its extreme individualism, with its prioritization of consumption, with its questioning of collectivist values, solidarity, and whatever comes from it, such as trade unions and so on and so forth. It's interesting to think, to take this as a benchmark and then think about what has changed since then. And this is of course very speculative, and it's just an invitation to reflection, I would say. But if you look at what happened since then, if I were to summarize it in one word, I would say radicalization. Paradoxically, all elements of the early post-Cold War ideological landscape have radicalized in the 30 years since the Soviet collapse. I think the greatest radicalization is visible in the conservative camp, because globally you see conservatives who come out to basically question the existing order of things. They're no longer in favor of normalization in the sense of keeping things as they are, or just going slowly back to certain normality, or maybe dismantling certain elements of the existing system slowly, but they are for draining the swamp, they are for sort of destroying the existing structures. And here, of course, we should mention Trump, but also European right-wing populists of all sorts. And someone mentioned right-wing protests against vaccinations and general COVID skepticism, which is not, of course, only right-wing, but most of this movement has very strong conservative underlying agenda. And again, it shows the radical potential of this position. Russia, as has happened many times in these 30 years, is in many respects, or has been at least, in the forefront of that. Because on the one hand, yes, the Russian regime presents itself as a catacomb, as a force that is there to preserve the order. But the problem is that the order that Russia wants to preserve is no longer there. And Russia is not happy with the existing situation. So what they do is actually undermining the order in the name of an alternative order that probably has existed in the past and has been destroyed by the West, or is being destroyed by the West. And we should definitely go back to that order. And the most radical attempt to date to do something like that, of course, happened during the Russian Spring. That was the time where Russian conservatives sort of moved forward very forcefully and tried to establish a conservative utopia. Then, of course, they were sidelined by more pragmatic actors. But nevertheless, that was something that actually demonstrated the radical and disorderly potential of such traditionalist movements. And there might be more coming, of course. At the same time, liberalism, with its individualism and pro-market and consumerist values, has also become more radical because it radically foregrounds individuality today, with all this talk about safe spaces and freedom of choice and the importance of the importance of identity politics, understood as first and foremost, again, individual identity, not that much group and collective identities based on solidarity, but rather identities based again on this consumerist freedom of choice. Also, of course, there is a certain radicalization of the left wing, although that varies. Generally, the left remains in crisis. But what I see in Russia, at least, yes, of course, there is a lot of Stalinism, there is a lot of Soviet nostalgia in the left wing circles. But what I observe in Russia, and that is very encouraging to me, is first of all, of course, everyone says it now, that there is an emphasis on inequality. And the left is at the forefront of emphasizing inequality. There is a general interest in this problematic, and it has been very much promoted. But what is even more important is that there is definitely a rejection of the end of history Eurocentrism, in the sense that there is now definitely a readiness, at least, on the part of the Russian left to disengage from the eternal debate about Europe and whether Russia is European or not. There is actually a very critical attitude to the West and a clear movement against the idealization of the Western model. So the idea of a global solidarity comes to the fore. And at the same time, there is a clear understanding of the need to concentrate on Russia's problems per se, without trying to compare Russian issues with European issues and so on. This is definitely not yet in any way a hegemonic camp or a hegemonic movement, but at least the fact that such ideas are there and they're possible to articulate, and they find followers, and there is a certain community behind those ideas, I think it's very encouraging. But generally speaking, we're up to maybe quite a bit of upheaval in global politics. Look at what's going on in international relations, look at what's going on ideologically in general. There is definitely a lot of destabilizing forces in today's international system and in individual kind of separate national political systems also. To some extent, again, this is good, because what is being destabilized is the self-evident normality of capitalism and the market. This is something that is being very forcefully questioned from different corners right now. But at the same time, of course, this produces a lot of dislocation and a lot of instability, and we are facing very serious, very real risks of a major war, even in Europe today. So in that sense, we might be facing interesting times ahead, and I think the ideological transformation of the last 30 years is a major factor behind what we're experiencing right now and might experience in the nearest future. So let me stop here, and yes, I'm looking forward to your reactions.
Great, thank you. Yes, and you indeed brought many motifs from today's discussion together, while of course returning to the current political moment, which not all of us did, but it's extremely important. So Keti wanted to say something?
Yes, well, actually, I also touched upon this conservative alt-right move. But I have a comment to what Vyacheslav was saying concerning the transformation and shift in the conservative rhetoric, which, for instance, a little bit earlier, if we take Dugin, for instance, was much more imperialist, but now it converges and merges very often with decolonial and post-colonial discourse in arguments like, for instance, the Marxist ideology was suppressing, for instance, real communality of Russian peasants, or the Marxist ideology was suppressing very peculiar life forms in Central Asia or many other places. So this internationalist idea of the unification is criticized from post-colonial point of view, but at the same time, it is somehow very profitable for the conservative Eurasian or Russian nationalist ideologists. Well, so this was the question or comment.
No, I definitely agree, and I think there is a certain, let's say, I would even call it reactionary. There is a certain reactionary potential.
You would not. You would call, or you would not call.
I would call it reactionary, yes, in post-colonialism. Because there is a tendency to relativize, and especially, I mean, this is most evident in decolonial approaches, where you basically valorize indigenous experience to the point where it becomes your only point of reference, and then anything goes, essentially. Then you can actually approve of anything in the name of the indigenous culture, which is, of course, let's say, largely speaking, invented, because there is no culture. If such cultures exist, they're very minor and cannot really be a source of inspiration for everyone. But most cultures have been irreversibly transformed by colonialism. So there is no culture that is pure, and pre-colonial today. You cannot really go back to the roots. And this is something that is I think, often denied explicitly or implicitly by a lot of post-colonial literature. So my point of reference here would be Dipesh Chakrabarty and his Provincializing Europe, which actually is very strongly brings forward this idea that, it's not about abandoning the Enlightenment, it's just about adding something to the Enlightenment, which actually changes the perspective crucially, but retains the universalist potential of the Enlightenment paradigm. I think this book is still very, very relevant and important for today's thinking.
Yes, thank you. I would agree. But another thing is that it's very interesting that Russia and Russian imperialism in that sense is also localized, and then it can be inscribed in post-colonial discourse, because if Russia is an empire, second world empire, it cannot be part of post-colonial discourse. But if it is some sort of state which was dominated by Marxist ideology, then it is also becoming the post-colonial victim, so to say. And I hear more and more arguments of that sort, here and elsewhere.
Yes.
Well, there is the famous book by Vyacheslav Morozov, which you might not know. So Russia, yes, or Soviet Union, I forgot.
Now Russia is post-colonial identity.
Russia is a post-colonial empire.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So Slava precisely brings this forward.
Yeah, but what I was about to say is that even Vladimir Putin himself played with this idea of sort of anti-colonial, at least, critique of the West, but then around 2010, if I remember correctly, but then he abandoned it for obvious reason that it's too risky when you start actually bringing up all those issues about, yes, well, in whose name are you actually criticizing the West and so on. But yes, it's actually it's true that it's possible to use anti-colonial rhetoric for the sake of all sorts of conservative and even imperialist projects in the periphery, or when we're talking about sort of second-tier empires. Yeah, that's very much true.
Okay, now we can question to Slava, or we can also move to the general discussion if someone wants to say something in general. So Vyacheslav, what is your theory about why this universal conservatism and why this insistence on reactive or reactionary politics? What happened?
Well, okay, the insistence on reactionary politics, that was not my general point. That's what I said about post-colonialism.
Reactive, rather reactive, one that reacts to something.
Okay. Well, I think it's obvious, right? It's just the fact that the transition, even in the successful cases, has left so many people behind that it created a pool or a constituency, large global constituency for this type of thinking. And that's also a symptom of the crisis of the left in that sense, because actually this constituency potentially is a constituency of people who would support left-wing agendas. But instead, what is happening is that they are reacting to the most visible symptoms of their oppression. And that would be liberal, cosmopolitan, individualist globalization and globalizing discourses. That turns into a resource for all sorts of right-wing entrepreneurs. And actually, the topic that we're discussing today, and in that sense, I agree with both Jodi and I think Keti also brought it up, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major factor in that sense, because it created this sort of allergy in many countries, including the country where I am based, to anything that even remotely resembles the Soviet Union, the Soviet past, any sort of socialist left-wing values, because that's anathema. That's something that goes against the nature, the natural order of things. Which is about capitalism, individual rights, and freedom of entrepreneurship and other things. And that I think is a major obstacle that the left has to overcome. And it's not exactly clear how to do that. There is no silver bullet. I think it's not possible to just solve it by finding a solution. It has to be done by simply talking and engaging with the Soviet legacy in a way that would not be dogmatic either way. It has to constantly, dialectically address the Soviet past and actualize it for today's situation.
Yeah, this is a very important point, and I think we have to write this down and put into some kind of motto, because this very deep engagement with Soviet legacy is important, even though it was short-lived, but the legacy is huge. Jodi.
I'm going to say something similar to what you just said, Artemy. I think that Vyacheslav's point here about this allergy to left values, or we could say a symptomatic response to the loss of the Soviet Union as a symbolic core, regardless of what it in practice, is absolutely a crucial element of the collapse from 1991, and something that the left has to grapple with, right? If not the only option is this, or not an option for us, but is this rising fascism. And one of the things I really love about Keti's analysis is, I think Vyacheslav is right. It's not like there's not going to be one silver bullet. There's not going to be one answer, one thing. But Keti takes us very far in emphasizing the way that much of the criticism of the Soviet socialism is actually not a criticism of socialism. It's a criticism of the failures of socialism, or the limits of socialism, the capitalism in the interstices, the continued presence of capitalism. And I think that her emphasis on the actual values of socialism are not what's criticized, is something to hold on to and part of the remedy for Left Project going forward.
Okay, so Jodi and Keti, they make some kind of a...
I have a question, Artem, to you.
Yeah.
For me, this issue of convergence of capitalism and socialism, and Hannah Arendt's argument that actually capitalist state and socialist state are quite similar in many points, was always very painful. So what is your attitude? Would you agree with this point? I mean, what is your approach to this?
My own approach.
Yes, do you think that the affinities that Arendt finds in these two systems, state systems, are reliable, I mean?
My point, again, I had to, even though I spoke longer than others, but I still was very short in my own standards, so I didn't really formulate my own point, what I really think.
Mm-hmm.
But many of you know what I really think. I think that what actually takes place is a dialectic of socialism and capitalism. So you cannot really find capitalism or socialism in its pure. So to start with, you know, capitalism is a socialist concept and socialism is a capitalist concept. Yeah, the perspective is already embedded. The alternative perspective is already embedded into these regimes and into these ideas. So provided this, I think these are pretty strong historical forms that don't seem to go away very easily. There is democracy as a third term to this dialectic, and it slightly complicates these things. So, and in terms of what I would value here, I would value some kind of socialism with some capitalist elements, you know, NAP or something. You can allow a free market for food and cafes, something like that, and then very strong, you know, very strong authoritarianism in terms of politics and in terms of large enterprise.
I think this would immediately end the socialist model, because after NEP you have to refer back to the previous condition. Otherwise, you cannot stop it, because
this is Larissa Piasheva and Alexander Tsipko either or argument.
Yeah,
I precisely I don't share it.
May I mention one more argument? It comes from Althusser. Althusser had this very interesting dialectical approach. Of course, he would not claim that capitalism and socialist states are the same, but he says that the struggle, the socialist struggle and communist struggle within capitalism is more reliable as communist than this frozen socialist state that ends up with class struggles. So the socialist state paradoxically is more capitalist than the communist agenda within capitalist state in its perspective of dialectical development.
Do you agree with Keti? How can you agree with this?
I don't agree with this.
No, goes against your conviction.
No, I totally disagree with this. So that's
okay, then I also disagree. Here we agree to disagree.
Yeah.
This is ridiculous. Precisely, I mean, it's very easy to be socialist in a bourgeois society, being a bourgeois. One has to prove it with institutions living in such a situation. Here, I'm on your side. What I am probably where I do disagree with you is that I'm against purism in any regard.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I want a mixed regime with some kind of hegemony for left wing and socialist and communist ideas and ideals. What do you guys think? I mean, Vyacheslav said this a little bit about contemporary, not even restoration, but contemporary move back from the progressive politics of the Cold War. I mean, in the Cold War, at least both sides claimed some social progress, competed for this, had global empires. Then there was a very short period of world empire described by Negri, but that lived for 10 years. And now it seems that we are back to 19th century, as I wrote in Facebook today. The 90, and this confirms Jodi's impression that the 91 was some kind of a beginning of a retarded movement. Yes, the movement backwards in history to conservative nationalism on all fronts, and I don't see a new universalism again beyond the socialist communist project. Yeah, I see nods. And Jodi is asking until when we wanted to stay here, but we wanted to stay here until 9. So basically we are done. Everyone is free. But I always think that the most intelligent thought comes at the very end. Almost like in the Soviet Union, when everything was clear only by the end. If there are no most intelligent thoughts, then you can spell them out in comments and writing. So thank you very much, the participants, and most importantly our YouTube audience, which we unfortunately don't experience even virtually this time, and this is the condition of today's setting. But we are very grateful to the audience, and we are open to the audience in the sense that if you have questions, you can still address them to us through any social networks, emails, where you find them. For example, if you have a question to me, you put it as a comment to my posting of this conference in Facebook, and I will respond to you immediately, and it will also be public, so everyone will see, and many of us will do this.
Just a small suggestion that probably for the future it would be good to invite a person who deals with Chinese context, contemporary Chinese context, to make comparisons.
Absolutely, we even know several such people, but we wanted to focus on this particular event. And but you know, in China, more or less at the same time, a couple of years in advance, it was a different historical moment. There was a Tiananmen, and then there would be a discussion of Tiananmen that would be important. But again, our time is not infinite. When the COVID passes, and we will be able to all actually touch each other, then we can repeat this discussion and do it physically. Then we can take not 2 hours, but 6 hours, and invite the Tiananmen specialist, you know, the Bucharest specialist, the Poland specialist, which was mentioned today, by the way, the abortions, and we would invite Christine Godze to discuss the sexuality of Soviet women. So there are many ways to develop this conference, and I also will talk, and we'll also think of maybe publishing these proceedings somewhere as a round table or something. But I'm very satisfied. This was very rich, and I had many new ideas while listening to you. Hope you too. Communism is down, but long live communism.
Ciao, thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.